Love your city, every back road, every alley, every pothole. Love your city, every back road. Come together, fight for your home.
What's up, everyone? This is Bob Dalton with the Love Your City podcast. Each episode, I interview people doing grassroots work in their communities. This episode's a little different. It's a featured episode where I have the privilege to interview Tina Rosenberg. She's an author, a journalist, and the co-founder of Solutions Journalism, an organization with the mission to transform journalism so that all people have access to news that helps them envision and build a more equitable and sustainable world. Thank you, Tina, for joining me on the podcast.
My pleasure, Bob.
As you know, I tell you this every time I get to talk with you, I deeply admire your work, and I always tell people that if I wasn't running my own organization, that I would find a way to apply to work with you at Solutions Journalism. And I think the work that you're doing is extremely important, what I would consider some of the most important work that we could focus on as it pertains to society and changing society for the better. So I'm excited for this conversation. I'm very, very thankful that you would take the time, and I just consider you one of my personal heroes.
That is so sweet. Thank you for those kind words. I also believe that this work is very important and bringing a needed change to journalism.
Well, let's start with some framework. I'd love to have you define the term solutions journalism before we dive into kind of talking about the actual work itself.
Sure. So as readers and viewers and listeners all know, most journalism is about problems, which is why we get endlessly depressed when we look at the news. Solutions journalism covers responses to problems. It tries to rebalance the news by reporting on problems and reporting on how people are trying to solve those problems, not doing it as advocacy or cheerleading or fluff or good news in quotes, but as rigorous journalism, looking at what people are doing to try to solve a problem and what we know about how well that's working, what's working about that response, what's not working about that response.
Is it a little bit disappointing that you had to create the form of solutions journalism, and that do you believe that all journalism should be naturally solutions journalism, or is it a specific type of focus?
That's a good question. Certainly not all journalism should be solutions journalism. I mean, there is absolutely, we need to be watchdogs. We need to be doing investigative reporting and reporting on the world's problems. And there are many. I'm saying that we should shift the balance over a tiny bit. So we make room for reporting on how people are trying to solve those problems. And we didn't invent this idea. We put a name on it and a system for doing it and a way to teach it. But people have been doing solutions journalism for a long time, probably without calling it that or even knowing they're doing it. I mean, for example, you say you're an Oregonian. Michael Lewis decided he wanted to write a book about the corrosive influence of money in baseball. And he could have done that by following a crap loser team around for a year and show them doing poorly because they didn't have any money. But instead, he wrote Moneyball, right? About how this a poor team, a low-income team was doing with this new strategy. That's solutions journalism. But I'm sure if you asked Michael Lewis if it was, he'd say, what's that?
Yeah. Well, journalism as we know it, as you kind of alluded to with it being hyper-focused on problems of society, based on your knowledge and the history of journalism, was it always like that? Have we always been a little bit leaning on focusing on the problems of society?
It hasn't always been like that. Investigative journalism has been a thing, as my kids would say, in journalism for more than 100 years. But journalism has actually historically suffered from the opposite problem, which is just being stenographers for people in power and, giving influential people a hall pass to go out and, we're going to look the other way. That changed in the mid-1970s with Watergate and the Vietnam War. And since then, journalism has been focused almost exclusively on problems. And I think today a lot of journalists are tired of reporting on the same problem over and over again. And we know that our communities are tired of reading about the same problem over and over again. And in fact, that the depression and and feeling of helplessness that results is the single biggest reason that people stop engaging with the news. But a lot of journalists are afraid to try and report the stories of what's working because they don't want it to come out looking soft, looking like advocacy or cheerleading, because that is the worst sin a journalist can commit, according to journalism itself. That's probably not the way the outside world sees it. So if we can show them how to do these stories with high standards so that they're professionally safe for journalists to do, then we get people engaged in this kind of solutions work.
Yeah, we'll dive into the standards of solutions journalism here in a second, but take us back into your journey of journalism and how you got involved in it and what sparked your interest in it.
It runs in my family. My grandfather was a journalist in the Yiddish press in New York City. He was an immigrant from Lithuania. And he used to bring me into his newspaper when I was little and show me the linotype machines. And so kind of in my blood. And I started as a freelancer. Then I went to work for the New York Times. And I worked overseas. I was in Latin America for about 6 years. And most of what I covered was public health, human rights, really depressing stories. And what got me into solutions journalism was in the year 2000, I was working for the Sunday magazine of the New York Times, and I proposed a story on the price of HIV medicines in low-income countries. And these triple therapy had just been invented like 5 years ago, and it was saving lives in wealthy countries. But nobody in Africa, nobody in Latin America or Asia could afford $12,000 a year, $10,000 a year, even $20,000 for these drugs. That was widely known, but what was not widely known at the time was why the prices were so high. And so I wanted to tell this investigative story about collusion between the pharmaceutical industry and the government of turn in Washington, Democrat, Republican, didn't matter, to put political pressure on countries so they would not make or buy generic versions of drugs. So I proposed that to my editor, and I thought, it's a really important story. Remember, this was 2000. And he said, can't do it. It's too depressing, and our readers already know that everybody in Malawi with HIV is going to die. So I went home and I rethought it, and I turned the piece inside out. And there was one country that was actually making its own generic versions of drugs and giving them out for free to all its people who needed them, and that was Brazil. So the story became what Brazil was doing and how Brazil was able to do it. But in the course of telling that story, I could say everything I wanted to say about the bad behavior that was going on and the pressures that Brazil had to fend off. So it was a much better way of telling the story. It got published, first of all. It felt exciting and empowering and fresh to readers. And it helped to shift the debate because it showed that, contrary to what pharmaceutical industry was saying, countries like Brazil could do this successfully. And so the debate had been, can poor countries do antiretrovirals? And it helped to move the debate a little to how can poor countries all do what Brazil's already doing? And that story will be on my gravestone. Most important thing by far I've ever written. And since then, every time I do a story or did a story where my editor would say, oh, that's too depressing, which is about everything I write, I think about, is there a way to turn this inside out and tell it through a solutions perspective?
So after that story, where did you go in your career from there?
In 2010, David Bornstein, who's now my co-founder at Solutions Journalism Network, David and I started to write a column in the New York Times called Fixes, which is a solutions column. Every week we wrote about some response to a social problem and what separates success from failure. And then 3 years later, we started the Solutions Journalism Network to spread this idea around because we thought this is really a change that needs to happen on a wider scale in journalism.
Let's dive into the standards of solutions journalism and how you guys came up with those standards.
It's a really good question, and I'm not sure I could answer the how part. But there's basically four things, the four pillars of solutions journalism. One is it's about a response and how it happened. It's not just about a problem, and it has to go into some depth about the response and what it was. Second of all, it is based in evidence and not just good intentions. You're not interested in how how wonderful the person is, how generous, how thoughtful they are. You're interested in results. What happened here? What do the evidence tell us about what happened? Third of all, it's not inspirational or not just inspirational. It's not like the kid with the lemonade stand who raises money for Ukraine. It's got to be something that can be replicated and can make a difference and your story has to offer insights that are valuable to society about how to do that. And then fourth of all, it has to be real journalism in the sense that it has to tell you what's not working. It has to cover the limitations. There's no such thing as a perfect program, and you don't have any credibility if you claim something's perfect. So just, embrace the limitations and talk about what are the challenges that still remain. So those things, that it's about a response and the how, that it covers the limitations, that it's about evidence, and it's about insight. Those are really what makes a solutions journalism story. And I think that probably just developed out of the fixes column and what we were looking for when we decided what to write about.
Well, let's take a case study, for example. Let's come up with a story that you may be familiar with. Take a story that you can think of, and then look at it from a solutions journalism standpoint, and then look at it from maybe a normal solutions approach.
Mm-hmm. Well, for example, flooding. This is a problem in a lot of communities, and there's been endless amounts of stories done about flooding problems and, how they affect people and the damage and what causes them. A solutions approach to that would be to take a city that has made progress, perhaps completely solving a flooding problem, maybe not, maybe just doing a lot better than it used to do, and looking at how they did it and what made it work. That's a solutions approach. It's actually absurdly simple when you think about it.
And then what about how would a kind of normal journalist approach it right now in a kind of more of a issue focused? Like they would just write the article on how bad the flooding is in a particular city?
Well, if you work in Lafayette, Louisiana, then flooding is going to be a constant concern, and you're going to have written about it many, many, many times. And your readers all know about that problem. So, amidst the problem stories you're writing, look for solution stories as well. It can be other cities, or it can be a neighborhood, for example, in Lafayette. Maybe there's a neighborhood that planted like rain gardens and parks, and left marshland alone to absorb water, and they don't tend to get flooded when the rest of the city gets flooded. That's a story. That's a story. So usually if you're a beat reporter on anything to do with education or environment or health or criminal justice or even sort of, how democracy works, you're doing problem story after problem story.
Yeah.
So, look for what's working. Ask people, who's doing a better job? And go look at that.
Yeah, that's amazing. More of a holistic approach to the story.
It is.
With solutions journalism and the work that you guys are doing now, how big is your team?
I'd say we have about 50 employees.
Okay. And they're all mostly based here in New York City?
No, they're not. We've got maybe a third of them are here.
Okay.
And we have folks all around the country, and we've got folks in Latin America. We've got folks in Europe. We've got folks in Asia. We have partner organizations that we work with and support in Africa and Eastern and Central Europe, all around the world now.
So as you are all spread out, what is the primary work that you all do as an organization based on these standards of solutions journalism? What is your approach?
Right. It's changing. It has been, we train newsrooms to do these kinds of stories with high standards. We operate B2B. We're not a destination site. We don't do solutions journalism, although a lot of us do as a sideline. Mm-hmm. But Solutions Journalism Network doesn't publish solutions journalism. But we teach other organizations how to do it. Because we decided we want to scale this up. We feel like the world needs this on a larger scale for various reasons in terms of how toxic journalism is to public trust, how misleading and distorting it can be when marginalized neighborhoods are covered purely through the lens of their worst stereotype. We need to spread this. And so our approach now is building networks. It's finding existing organizations and helping them integrate solutions journalism training into their work So we are not the direct service provider, but instead we are creating a network of trainers and champions who will then go out and spread the word because they believe in it.
How do you find these newsrooms and journalists and get a hold of them in order to start a training like that? Are they coming to you? Are you finding them? How do you actually gauge the interest of journalists that want to change their approach?
Well, that's such a good question. We used to cold call when we were new. Now, I mean, we've trained some like 30,000 journalists and we've worked with hundreds of newsrooms. They generally come to us. We ask before we go in and do a training in a newsroom that the top leadership has to be invested in this. It'll go nowhere if it's like a couple of reporters, but they don't have the buy-in from the top. So that's really important. And increasingly, we're interested in having newsrooms understand how to change systems in their newsroom so that they can do this on a sustainable basis. Journalism, as you have probably heard, is in serious trouble. Like a quarter of the newsrooms in the United States have closed in recent years. Pretty soon it'll be a third. The ones that exist are much smaller. There's a terrible economic crisis that began with Craigslist taking away classified ads from newspapers at the turn of the millennium, and has gone on now with Google and Facebook taking almost all vast lion's share of online advertising. So journalism has lost its business model. In addition, there's an existential crisis. People don't trust us. They don't like us. And so there is a lot of interest in trying something new. People want to do this. They're excited about it. They get it. They understand it. The problem is that because they are so strapped for resources and so busy, it's hard for them to get the time to do it. They're thinking, I really want to do this story, but it's just a little different than what I have on my plate. So I'll deal with it tomorrow. Right now I'll do my stories for today. And I'll do it tomorrow. And tomorrow never comes. That's the problem, is how newsrooms can create systems that free reporters up from the hamster wheel coverage, the daily stuff, in order to do these stories, and reward reporters for doing it. And that's really the challenge. It's not changing attitudes, it's changing behavior that's the challenge.
With the business model changing, which is really fascinating, with the advertising world essentially changing alongside it, which is causing a lot of it, and just technology in general. TV is different, rapidly changing. The way that people engage in apps and technology
Absolutely.
and the internet is changing.
Yep.
People are more annoyed with advertising more than ever before. The age of advertising is drastically changing. That causing kind of a disruption and a decline in the previous journalism business model. Are you worried about that? Are you concerned about 1/3 of newsrooms and journalists getting displaced? Or is this an opportunity to reinvent something that has historically needed some rethinking?
Oh, hell yes, I'm worried. Everybody should be worried. I mean, we know what happens to cities when they lose their newspaper. Bad behavior happens. Just corruption goes up, your bond rating goes down, all sorts of stuff happens when government officials know that there's nobody watching us. We can do whatever we want. So it's a big problem. And the loss of a quarter of local news in the United States is a huge, huge problem. There is also a smaller, much, much, much smaller upside in that there is experimentation. There are new things being tried. Journalists are, I think, doing better at really knowing what does serving our community really mean and asking the community what that really means. And that sort of innovation would not have happened back when we were all fat and happy. It's happening now. And a lot of the new news that's out there is much better than the old, but it's nowhere near enough to make up for the fact that this decline is not only enormous, but accelerating.
Yeah, with potentially politicians and corporate executives that are looking at this going, we may be able to get away with more. Was journalism ever meant to be some sort of an accountability system to hold these people accountable to their behavior? Or is that a secondary result of something?
I'd say most journalists feel like holding people accountable is their major job.
Do you feel like that's right? And does that play into this kind of cancel culture mindset that we have, where we do feel like we need to kind of call people out when we see some sort of wrong happening?
I'm not sure I'd call that cancel culture. I mean, if somebody's stealing from the public till, it's not cancel culture to publish a story saying, caught you. But I feel like that's sort of the royalty of journalism does that kind of work, that kind of accountability, investigation. Investigative journalism has always been seen, not always, but since the mid-'70s as the highest form of journalism. I think that has caused neglect of the other things that journalism should do. And it's right now that journalists are also focusing on the daily, what we're reporting on day to day, and making that as good as we can make it, making that as rich and as important and valuable to the community as we can make it. But I do want to say something about accountability journalism, which is that solutions reporting is a part of accountability journalism. It's like with the Brazil story, it would not have been as powerful an indictment of the system back in 2000 if we had not had Brazil in that story to show that it could be done. If you add a solutions component to an investigation, you're taking a problem that people who are behaving badly can dismiss as unavoidable. Oh, we're doing the best we can. And you're making it actually unacceptable because you're not doing the best we can. Because look over here, they're doing better. And they don't have any more resources than you do. So I think solutions journalism is a really important component of accountability journalism.
Yeah. To do solutions journalism well, it seems, and to make sure that it kind of checks all the boxes of those standards and forms that you've put in place of understanding what solutions journalism is, in order to do it well, it seems like you would need a little bit of time to actually look at a story holistically and talk with people. It seems very different than journalism now, which is breaking news. How do you deliver stories in a timely fashion, but not risk the facts?
Yeah, great question. Breaking news will always be with us and should always be with us. Solutions journalism is a form of what we call enterprise work. Feature stories, investigative stories, profiles, explanatory journalism. These are sort of longer, richer pieces, and solutions journalism is a part of that. And those pieces, you are correct, they do take a little longer, but they do add more value also. I mean, a lot of news organizations we work with have found that taking away a lot of the incremental stories, like stuff that's, we're covering it today, we're going to cover a development tomorrow, we're going to cover another development tomorrow. If we decide not to do that coverage, and instead we do a solution story, you can do one solution story instead of three normal stories, but you'll have 9 times the interest. People spending the time with the story, the trust building, the value that it brings to your audience and to your news organization is higher.
Maybe more so in the past than now, but there's a lot of power in the pen. And what do you feel like, what would you say to all of the journalists out there that have this responsibility of delivering news?
Look, none of us got into this profession because we want to get rich, right? I mean, most people become journalists because they want to tell stories and they want to make a difference. And the fact is that our profession has largely been on autopilot. We're doing it this way because we've always done it this way. And if we sit down and we really think about what serves our communities, what makes us valuable, you'll come up with a different way of doing journalism. And that's going to include solutions reporting.
Mm-hmm. We both would agree, and I think many would agree with us, that journalism has either been kind of rushed into the breaking news realm and potentially have risked all of the facts and the details. You have certain people that have deemed the media fake news. How correct is that observation?
You know, the mainstream media, obviously, which I'm a part of, having worked at the New York Times for so long, isn't fake news. We do make mistakes, and hopefully we correct them once we make them. But I would defy anybody to find a story that is made up from whole cloth. I mean, a lot of people think that journalists don't report. We just sit at our desks and we make this shit up, and it's in response to somebody giving us instructions on what to do. And that is totally false, totally false. We are actually really concerned with reporting the truth. We do reporting. We are trying to get it right. Sometimes in the rush of time, we don't get it right, but it's not fake news. That charge is cynical. We know that is a charge that arises when the mainstream media publishes something that people don't like.
Yeah. Coming back to the business model real quick, with the decline of journalism and the business model rapidly changing, do you have anything that you would offer as insight on what that potential future business model could be for journalism?
Another great question. And there's a lot of people working on this and a lot of experimentation going on. And there's subscriptions, which will not work for everyone. There's membership, which means that I'm going to support my news organization, but it's not a transactional thing like buying a subscription. It's more like, I am a member of this. I support you because I believe in you. There's business sponsorships of particular projects, and solutions journalism lends itself to that. There's a lot of philanthropic funding now in journalism. I mean, local philanthropy has, for decades and decades, supported the ballet, the museum, other institutions in our cities. Well, I got to break it to you that I think journalism is at least as important, if not more important, to our city's civic life than those institutions. And if some of that money could go to supporting great civic journalism, that's a business model. And that is increasingly happening. So there are other things besides advertising. And right now, the successful news organizations are the ones that do a little of everything. But it's not making up for the loss of advertising yet.
Yeah. Yeah, and the advertising, and I because I have a for-profit business and really studying advertising a lot over the past few years and how much it's changed through digital media and the way that people, not just how expensive advertising is for companies and how that's changed the landscape, but also the way in which people are receiving ads. Ads have become an annoyance.
Yeah.
It used to be cool to have an ad in a magazine. Now it's not cool to be showing up on a particular social media. But I don't know if you know this, Tina, but times are changing.
I've heard that phrase somewhere.
And people don't read as much as I believe they used to read from a generational standpoint. How is that?
Kids these days.
Well, kids these days. Journalism obviously can be done through a lot of different mediums. What do you feel like here in this next season, 2022, moving into 2023, what is some of the most powerful mediums for journalism?
Well, we need to acknowledge that most people get their news from two places. Local TV news is still the biggest source of news, and a lot of local TV news is really bad, especially coverage of crime, which is basically limited to, I'm standing here in front of a chalk outline on the sidewalk. I mean, I live in one of the safest cities in the world, New York City, and if I watch local TV news, it makes me afraid to go out of my door. Mm-hmm. And that is toxic. Mm-hmm. And what does that make us think about? These communities that are covered purely through that lens. It's terrible. So that's one source. The other source is social media. And a lot of people don't realize that, hey, Instagram doesn't do this journalism. Somebody else has to, and that somebody else is usually working for a news organization. The concept of a newsroom, of a publisher, has dropped away, and the unit now is an individual story rather than a magazine or a newspaper. So people are still consuming news. It's shorter, it's more visual, and it's largely on their phones through social media. Mm-hmm. And obviously, one of the huge problems that leads to is the filter bubble. You decide you want to follow certain people and your worldview gets reinforced, and that's what you see. And, we used to, everybody's entitled to their own opinions, but now we live in a world where everyone has their own facts. And that's unfortunate. That is bad.
Yeah, algorithms have played a massive part in that as well.
Yes.
I mean, if you look at Twitter news, I open up Twitter news every day and kind of check out what's going on. That is algorithmically showing me what it thinks that I should read or what it thinks that I want to read.
Yep.
Which can be very dangerous.
Yep.
It's keeping me within a particular circle of media and news and feeding me a particular story. Do you have any suggestions on news outlets or platforms that you would suggest? How do you typically give advice when people are looking to educate themselves on what is going on? Where can I find good journalism?
I'm kind of a big fan of the New York Times. I really feel like they do fantastic work in general, and that for many people that will reveal huge biases on my part, but I feel that much of the established mainstream media is pretty trustworthy and does good work.
How much of their journalism do you feel like is solutions journalism?
They do a lot of it. They do. I mean, I'm working with them on a new project. Our column ended after 11 years, but David and I are helping them with a project called Headway now, which is in the news section. And they just did a fantastic piece that was on the front page of the paper or the homepage about how Houston housed a quarter of its chronically homeless people, which is a hell of a lot of people. And they are really a leader in housing the homeless. And so how did they do it? Times does stories like that a lot.
How important do you feel like in a city like Houston is local journalism? Like how important is local journalism versus doing a piece on a national potential suggestions on solutions to homelessness in America versus solutions to homelessness in Houston?
Yeah.
What's the power in the conversation in your circles of journalists? Where does local fit in that, and how important is it?
I think that local journalism is hugely important. I mean, for me, the Times is my local paper. But a local journalism has more credibility and more trust than national news. And increasingly, local news organizations are really sticking to local. For example, their editorials are going to be talking about local issues. We're not going to talk about national issues because that just invites incivility and polarization when we do that. So, I mean, local news coverage is absolutely crucial. And solutions journalism really works for local news in two ways. One is you can find solutions worth covering in your own city, but also you can find solutions worth covering that are not in your own city, but are relevant to your own city. I mean, redefining local in a way as, stuff that's useful here and we should know about here. So if the Houston Chronicle or Houston City paper, I'm now making this up, I actually don't know if there's a Houston City paper, if they run a story about something that's going on in San Antonio that's working, but it's relevant for Houston, that's important too.
Yeah, I feel like people who are taking in some sort of local media, they're really wanting to see what is the world around me proximity-wise. Mm-hmm. With that local media or just journalism locally in general, what do you feel like is the goal with people reading and taking in that information? Is there a goal of hopefully inspiring some sort of an action? Is it to be our job is just to share a particular story? Like, what is the ultimate outcome and goal for local journalism?
Yeah.
Or what should it be?
Yeah. I think what it should be is to give an accurate picture of the world. I'm old school in the sense of I don't believe it is the job of journalism to tell people here's how you can change this or to inspire people to change it. But I think it is our job to report on how people are changing things.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think intuitively that can inspire people to think in
That's
different
true.
pathways and either look to join a particular solution or get involved.
Yep.
Which I do think a lot of people are looking and searching and wanting more of those stories. They want some sort of glimpses of hope. We are exhausted as a society of really reading fear-based, issue-focused journalism and media and watching it over and over again. With the narratives that are being portrayed in our communities in the United States and around the world, who's driving these narratives at the end of the day? Is it the journalists Is it the companies, the newsrooms, corporate sponsors? Who's driving the narrative when you really boil it down?
What a great question. I think, frankly, the most important thing driving the narrative is the culture of journalism. Here's how we've always done it. We go cover press conferences because someone important has something to say. Well, really, let's sit down and think for a minute about whether that's actually important to our community or whether we should be using our time to do something else. It's not hard to do great journalism. What's hard is to stop doing other things to free up time and money to do great journalism. But you can't do everything. You got to choose. And it's hard for journalists to abandon stuff they've always been doing, even if it's not very useful anymore. So the culture of journalism, and that has created sort of systems for how newsrooms are set up and what gets rewarded and what gets done. If a newsroom has a board up, an electronic board that shows, the number of clicks each reporter has collected on their stories, then that is a bad thing. And that is going to reinforce the culture of, I need to do a lot of clickbait stories because I want those clicks. If the editor has a morning meeting every day and says, well, what you got for me today, then that's a bad thing because the pressure is on journalists to say, what can I do that I can do in like 3 hours? And that's not what you want. So those things have to change and to a certain extent are changing.
How old were you when you started getting into journalism?
I would say pretty much out of college.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you use the example of journalism as like painting, and you're painting this picture, you're painting a story, what would you go back in time and say to Tina Rosenberg right out of college who's holding a paintbrush, looking at a blank canvas? What would you go back and
learn how to paint, first of all? I think that I did a lot of the same things wrong many journalists have done, which is I tended to cover, especially when I think about what I did in Latin America, cover marginalized communities in Latin America as helpless victims or as part of the problem, and not look at what they're doing that is strong and trying to solve their own problems. And I think by doing that, I reinforced stereotypes without thinking about it that people in the United States have about communities in Latin America. And there's equivalent stuff, in how people cover communities of color here in the United States. But I would say that is one thing I would very much like to change about my coverage.
What do you think that is the number one fear in the back of every journalist's mind right now?
Will I have a job tomorrow? That's the first one. But in terms of my work, journalists are very afraid of saying something is working and getting it wrong. It's not actually harder to get right, but the perceived consequences of getting it wrong are higher than if you say something's not working and you've gotten it wrong.
Well, being somebody who's done a lot of journalism and have written thousands of articles, what would you say to all those journalists now as kind of a word of encouragement or some sort of a helpful insight as they're navigating that?
That do the homework, get it right, but remember that it's our job to hold up a true mirror to society and not a distorted mirror. And that you might be writing only true facts, but they may add up to a very distorted picture if what you're considering to be worth covering is only negative.
The future of journalism, what is your hope?
My hope is that journalism grows, that local news recovers, that every person has access to local news that can tell them what they need to know about where they live, and that people cover the news in a way that's constructive and respectful and uncovers problems, but also uncovers solutions to problems.
Awesome. Well, thank you for taking time. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. Huge fan of your work. Yeah, I'm cheering you on, and I want to help in any way I possibly can with spreading the word about solutions journalism and this new approach of writing stories.
Thank you, Bob. It was really a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Love Your City podcast. If you want to find ways to get involved in your community, you can visit loveyourcity.org. If you have any questions or recommendations of grassroots leaders or nonprofits that we should be aware of, email us at media@loveyourcity.org.